He showed up at her door on a Tuesday, which was the day she always ran out of everything: coffee, clean towels, reasons to keep going. Tilda had been awake since 4, not because of insomnia, not exactly. More like her brain had decided sleep was a luxury she hadn't earned. She'd spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing 3 sets of books. The clean ones she filed with the city, the messy ones she kept for Harmon's people, and the real ones, the ones nobody was supposed to know existed. The real ones were always the smallest. The truth usually was. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment, with her back against the couch, because the couch was covered in papers, and she hadn't bothered to move them. There was a cup of coffee on the carpet beside her, cold, untouched since 2 in the morning. Her left knee ached. She was 28 years old, and her left knee ached like a woman twice her age, which was what happened when you spent your 20s hunched over ledgers in apartments with no heating. The knock came at 6:43. She knew because she looked at the clock on her laptop, a reflex, the same one that made her timestamp every entry, every correction, every discrepancy she found buried in Harmon's numbers. Time was evidence. Tilda had learned that early. She didn't move at first. The people who knocked on her door at 6:43 in the morning were either her landlord or bad news, and she'd been 2 weeks behind on rent since March, so the categories were not mutually exclusive. The second knock was harder. She got up, pulled her cardigan tighter. The heat had been out since Thursday, which her landlord knew and had chosen to treat as an opinion rather than an emergency. She looked through the peephole, which was cracked on one side and gave everything a slight fisheye tilt, and what she saw made her step back from the door. Creed Harmon did not visit people at their apartments. Creed Harmon summoned. He sent texts that were 5 words or fewer. He had a driver and an office and 4 people whose entire job was to make sure he never had to go anywhere he didn't want to go. Tilda had worked for him for 14 months, and in that time she had been to his building 11 times, and never, not once, had their relationship operated in the other direction. She opened the door anyway, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd figured out a long time ago that fear was not a reason to hide. Fear was information. You took it in, you weighed it, you decided what to do with it. Harmon looked exactly the way he always looked, like a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. 6'2", dark coat, the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from control. There was a scar along his jaw that she'd never asked about, and she wasn't going to start now. Behind him in the hallway, far enough back to be deniable, stood 2 of his men. She recognized the one on the left, Knox. She didn't know the other one's name and didn't want to. Voss, he said, her last name the way he always used it, not unkind, not warm. Just a word that meant her, the way a file number meant a case. Mr. Harmon. She held the door open, not an invitation, just not a barrier. He looked past her into the apartment. She watched his eyes move, across the papers on the couch, the cold coffee on the floor, the 3 laptops open at different angles, the takeout containers she hadn't thrown away yet, the single bare bulb in the kitchen because she'd never bought a lampshade. He looked at all of it and his expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "You're working," he said. "I'm always working." "On what?" She tilted her head. "Your books, Mr. Harmon. What else?" That was when he stepped inside, which she hadn't expected. He walked past her and stood in the middle of her apartment, and the 2 men stayed in the hall, and she closed the door because leaving it open felt more dangerous than closing it. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. Harmon didn't ask questions when he already knew the answer. Tilda had learned that in the first 2 weeks. "Yes," she said. "Sit down." She sat on the arm of the couch, the only clear space. He stayed standing. That was the geometry of the room, him in the center, her at the edge, and she noticed it the way she noticed everything, without showing that she noticed. "Tell me." So she told him. She walked him through it the way she always walked through numbers. No filler, no softening, just the sequence of what she'd found and when and what it meant. $340,000, moved over 9 months in increments, small enough to look like noise if you weren't looking for a pattern. She'd found the pattern. She always found the pattern. It was the only thing she'd ever been genuinely good at, and she'd learned not to feel proud of it because the things she was good at had a way of making her life more complicated. Harmon listened without interrupting. That was one of the things she'd noticed about him early. He actually listened, which was rarer than it should have been, especially in rooms full of men who thought listening was something you did while waiting for your turn to talk. When she finished, the apartment was very quiet. "Renshaw," he said. "Not a question. The pattern matches his access windows," she said. "I can't prove intent from numbers alone. But the access, the timing, the accounts, it's consistent." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. She made herself hold still under it, the way she'd trained herself to. She'd spent most of her life being looked at by people who were deciding what she was worth, and she'd learned that flinching didn't help. "How long have you known?" he said. 48 hours. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. And are you certain? I don't bring you things I'm not certain of." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, more like recalibration, like he was adjusting a number in a column. "You should have called me," he said. "You don't like calls before 7. I like missing $300,000 less." She didn't argue with that, because he was right. He moved then, crossing to the window. Her apartment was on the 4th floor, and the view was a brick wall and a fire escape, and, if you craned your neck, a slice of street that was mostly delivery trucks at this hour. Harmon stood at the window with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the brick wall like it had something to tell him. "How long have you been at this?" he said, meaning the papers, the laptops, the cold coffee. "Since yesterday afternoon." "Did you sleep?" "A little." He turned from the window and looked at her again, and this time she couldn't quite read it. Harmon was not a man whose face gave away much. She'd spent 14 months studying it across tables and conference calls, and she still only knew maybe 60% of his vocabulary. But this was one she hadn't seen before. "You live here," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something else. She wasn't sure what. "Yes," she said. "Alone, yes." He looked around the apartment again, the bare bulb, the papers, the cold. She'd lived here for 2 years, and in all that time, she'd never once been embarrassed by it. She didn't have the energy for embarrassment, and anyway she'd grown up in worse. But she felt something shift now, something she didn't like. Not shame, exactly. More like being seen doing something she'd thought was private. "The heat's been out," she said, because she felt like she had to say something. "Since Thursday." "My landlord is." She stopped. "It's not relevant. How long has your landlord known?" 4 days. Harmon pulled out his phone and typed something. Brief. 5 words or fewer, she was sure of it. He put the phone back in his coat. "It will be fixed today," he said. She opened her mouth and then closed it. The thing she'd been about to say, "You don't have to do that," wasn't actually useful, and she'd trained herself out of saying things that weren't useful. So she just said, "Thank you." He nodded, the way he acknowledged things that didn't require a response. "Pack what you need for a few days," he said. "You're not staying here." She stared at him. "I'm sorry. Renshaw knows I use an outside accountant. He doesn't know it's you, but if he's been watching the books closely enough to know someone is watching back." Harmon stopped. "Pack what you need. Mr. Harmon, I'm not going to Voss." His voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the thing about Harmon that people got wrong. They expected the volume to match the weight of what he was saying, and it never did. "Renshaw has done this before, not to me, but I know what it looks like when a man starts covering his tracks. You're the one who found the tracks. That makes you relevant to him." She sat with that for a moment. Let it settle into the part of her brain that processed risk the same way it processed numbers, without sentiment, without panic. He wasn't wrong. She hated that he wasn't wrong. "A few days," she said, "until it's handled, and my work. You can work from my building." He looked at the laptops. "Bring those." She started gathering things. Not much. She traveled light, had always traveled light, the kind of light that came from a childhood where you learned not to get attached to things because things had a way of disappearing. A bag, some clothes, the laptops, the hard drive she kept separate from everything else. Harmon stood in the center of her apartment, and watched her pack without pretending not to. "You don't have a coat," he said. "I have a coat. That's a cardigan." She looked down at the cardigan. She looked at the coat rack by the door, which held the coat she'd owned since college, a thin wool thing that had seen better decades. "I have a coat," she said again. He didn't respond, which she was starting to understand was a form of disagreement. The drive to Harmon's building took 20 minutes. She sat in the back of the car and kept her eyes on the window and her hands in her lap and didn't talk, which seemed to suit Harmon fine because he didn't talk either. Knox drove. The other man, she decided to think of him as Fletcher, privately, because she needed something to call him, sat up front. Nobody spoke. The building was what it always was, glass and granite, 42 floors, a lobby that had been designed to communicate that the people inside did not have to prove anything to anyone. The security team knew her face. She'd been here enough times that they waved her through, which was either a good sign or a very specific kind of trap. She'd been told her whole life that being recognized was good news, and she'd spent her whole life not quite believing it. The office Harmon gave her was on the 38th floor, smaller than his but with better light, and someone had already set up a second monitor which she hadn't asked for, and which made her throat do something she didn't have a word for. "There's a room on 39, Harmon said from the doorway. "If you need to sleep, I won't need to sleep. You've been awake since yesterday afternoon. I've been awake longer than that." He looked at her. She looked at the monitors. Eventually he left. She got back to work. The next 36 hours were the kind of time that collapsed when she tried to remember it later. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was numbers, and numbers didn't have the texture of memory the way events did. She found 3 more discrepancies. She built the full picture of what Renshaw had done, laid it out in a format that would hold up to scrutiny, and then she sat back and looked at it, and felt the particular hollow satisfaction of a proof completed. Harmon came in at one point. She wasn't sure when. Her relationship with time had become unreliable, and looked over her shoulder at the screen without asking permission. She didn't move. He studied the layout for a minute and then said, "This is thorough." "That's the job," she said. "Most people would have stopped at the 300. Most people aren't looking for what they're not supposed to find." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing there, which was a new sensation. She'd worked alongside people her entire adult life, and never particularly felt their presence as a physical thing. But Harmon had a gravitational quality that she couldn't quite logic her way out of. "Are you hungry?" he said. She almost said no reflexively. Then she thought about it and realized she hadn't eaten since. She couldn't actually remember. "Maybe," she said. He had food sent up. She ate at the desk, which she suspected he would have had something to say about if he'd been watching, but he wasn't, and she didn't change her habits for an audience she didn't have. That evening, or what she thought was evening, someone knocked on the office door, and it was not Harmon. It was a woman she didn't recognize, early 40s, with the kind of composed expression that suggested she'd been hired for it. "Mr. Harmon asked me to bring you these," the woman said, and held out a coat. Tilda looked at the coat. It was charcoal, good wool, the kind of coat that had a weight to it. "That's not," she started. "He said you'd say that," the woman said, which was not a sentence Tilda had been expecting. She took the coat. She didn't know what else to do with it. She slept for 4 hours on the couch in the room on 39, which was not the bed Harmon had mentioned, but which was better than her apartment floor and considerably warmer. She woke up with her cheek imprinted with the seam of a throw pillow and a clarity that sometimes came after the specific exhaustion of finishing something. Renshaw had been handled. She'd heard that much through the door, or inferred it. The particular quality of silence that followed a problem being resolved was something she'd gotten good at reading. She went back to the office and pulled up the last file. Harmon found her there an hour later. He looked at the screen and then at her and said, "You're still here." "I'm wrapping up. You've been here for 36 hours. The work isn't done until it's done." He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was a strange thing to think. It wasn't her desk. and looked at her with the particular quality of attention he had that made you feel like you were being read, and not in a bad way, just in a way that was more thorough than you were used to. "What did you do before this?" he said. "Before the accounting work." She glanced at him. He asked questions so rarely that when he did, she always felt slightly wrong-footed by them, like a step she'd expected to be there that wasn't. "Other accounting work," she said. "Before that, my father's books. He owned a hardware store." She paused. "Owned is generous. He ran it into the ground, and I spent 3 years trying to keep it from drowning, and it drowned anyway." "How old were you?" 22 when it started. 25 when I gave up." Harmon said nothing. She'd found that his silence was not the same as other people's silence. It wasn't waiting for her to fill it, it was actually something, an active quality, like he was absorbing what she'd said instead of just receiving it. "And your family," he said. "My father blamed me for the store." Which was, she stopped, reconsidered, accurate in some ways. "I made some bad calls on suppliers." She looked at the screen. "I was 22 and I'd never done it before. I made the same kind of calls anyone makes when they don't know what they're doing. But he'd needed someone to blame for a long time, and I was there." "And you stayed?" "For a while." She looked at her hands. "Until I didn't." The apartment she'd left at 25 was not an apartment she thought about much, which was its own kind of answer. You didn't think about the rooms you'd escaped unless you had to. "You're good at what you do," Harmon said. She looked at him. "I know." Something moved in his expression. She thought it might have been amusement, which was a word she'd never associated with Harmon before. "Most people don't say that," he said. "Most people apologize for knowing what they're good at," she said. "I stopped doing that." "When?" "When I figured out that the people asking me to apologize for it were the same people who needed me to be smaller so they could be bigger." She met his eyes. "That's not a dynamic I'm interested in anymore." Harmon was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. "I don't imagine it is." She wasn't sure what to do with that. She turned back to the screen, which was familiar ground, and pulled up the last column she needed to close out. He didn't leave. She noticed, the way she noticed things, peripherally, precisely. He was still in the chair across from the desk, not looking at anything in particular, or maybe looking at her. She couldn't tell without looking directly at him, which she was avoiding. "The coat," she said finally, because she had to say something. "I'll return it." "No," he said. "Mr. Harmon." "I know what you make," he said. "I set your rate." She stopped typing. "The coat stays," he said. She looked at him then, directly, which she usually rationed. He met her eyes with the same directness he brought to everything, and she had the sudden, disorienting sensation of being looked at by someone who wasn't trying to diminish what they saw, not building her up either, just seeing. "Okay," she said. She turned back to the screen. She finished the file 11 minutes later, saved it, backed it up in 2 places out of habit, closed the laptops in order. Then she sat back and let herself feel, for exactly 3 seconds, the particular relief of a completed thing. When she looked up, Harmon was watching her. "Done?" he said. "Done?" He nodded, stood, walked to the door and then stopped, one hand on the frame, and didn't turn around. "My CFO is leaving at the end of the month," he said. "The man who had the job before Renshaw decided I was too complicated. Which I am." He paused. "The position's been empty for 8 months. I've been having it handled piecemeal, which is inefficient," she said. "Yes." He still hadn't turned around. "You'd have to move into a proper office. Sign more paperwork. Stop working from the floor of apartments with no heat." She was quiet for a moment. "And if I find things you don't like, I expect you to find things I don't like," he said. "That's what the job is for." She thought about her apartment, the cold, the papers, the way she'd gotten used to being the only person who knew what she knew and having no one to give it to. "I'll need a second monitor," she said. He turned then. "Just barely." "Not all the way, enough. You already have one," he said. She looked at the desk, the monitor that had been set up before she arrived, the one she hadn't asked for. She thought about how long that had taken. The decision to have it there before she knew she'd need to stay. The coat, the food sent up without her asking. Harmon was a man who operated in calculations. She knew that. She'd known it from the first month, when she'd watched him make decisions that looked cold and turned out to be precise. He didn't do things without reasons. He didn't extend things, rooms, coats, monitors, without a ledger behind it. She wondered what column she'd been entered in, and then she thought, maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the right question was what she'd entered herself in, without noticing, over 14 months of Tuesday calls and numbered files, and the specific way his attention felt like the only room she'd ever been in that didn't require her to be less than she was. "I'll need access to the quarterly files," she said. "The ones you don't show the city. You'll have them. And I won't sign anything I haven't read. I'd be disappointed if you did." She thought about her father's hardware store, the way she'd tried to hold something together that didn't want to be held, the way she'd walked away from it eventually, not because she'd failed, but because she'd finally understood that some things weren't worth saving, and some things were, but only if you were the right person for them. She was good at knowing the difference. It was maybe the thing she was best at. "Okay," she said. "I'll take the position." Harmon looked at her. Outside through the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving, grinding, calculating its own losses and gains. She'd spent her whole life in it, and only ever felt like she was on the outside of the thing that mattered, like she was good enough to see the numbers but not to be part of them. "When do you want me to start?" she said. "You already started," he said. She almost smiled. Didn't quite. He moved to leave, and then, "Your apartment." She looked at him. "The lease," he said. "When does it end?" she told him. He nodded once and left. She sat with the quiet for a while. It was a different kind of quiet than her apartments. Warmer, fuller, the kind that came from a building that worked the way it was supposed to. She thought about the books she'd close and the ones she'd open, and what it would be like to do it here, at a desk, with 2 monitors, in a coat that was the right weight for the weather. She'd spent a long time carrying numbers for other people's problems. She'd never once thought about what it would feel like to carry them somewhere they actually mattered. She pulled the laptop back toward her, opened a new file, and started a column she'd been building in her head for weeks. A full restructuring of Harmon's inner accounts. Cleaner, harder to touch, the kind of thing that would take 6 months to build right and last for years after that. At the top of the column, in the field she always left for her own reference, she typed, "Day 1. Then she got to work.